Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Well, welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing another really awesome guest today involved in creating a better tomorrow for millions of people out there. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Ben Zimmer. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Priovant Therapeutics, which is a clinical stage biotech company. They're focused on developing novel therapies for autoimmune diseases associated with the greatest morbidity and mortality risks. Priovant is developing a really interesting oral therapeutic known as Brepocitinib. It's a first-in-class dual inhibitor of both TYK2 and JAK1, developing this across multiple severe autoimmune indications, really unlocking this treatment as an option for patients that are really underserved by all existing therapies. Brent joined Priovant from Roivant. There he was a member of their founding team back in early 2015, has held multiple leaderships across that organization, including as president of Roivant Health, COO and head of the public affairs. As president of Roivant, he was integrally involved in overseeing the launch of their Chinese biopharmaceutical subsidiaries and healthcare tech companies, including Datavant, as well as the computationally powered drug discovery platform at VantAI. Early in his career, he was a consultant at McKinsey, also co-founded a public policy nonprofit, did his undergraduate from Harvard in history, went on to get his law degree at Yale. A lot of really cool topics to get into today. Honored to have him. Ben Zimmer, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great having you. I really love all the topics we're going to be getting into. But before we touch on all things autoimmune disease, would love to give you the mic to talk a little bit more about yourself. I mean, you have a really interesting background in the sense that, you studied history undergrad, you did your thesis on American Middle Eastern policy, went on to work on certain aspects of the September 11th Commission report. Talk a little bit about yourself, Ben, if you would, and a little bit of what led you towards pharma ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. As you know, I have a somewhat idiosyncratic background. Studied history in undergrad, as you mentioned, worked at McKinsey for several years after that, then got a law degree, founded a public policy nonprofit that I ran for several years after that. I'd say a few common themes across all of that work is I've always been interested in topics and issues that I think really matter to people, and I've always been someone interested in doing work that I feel can really make a difference for a lot of people. And then another theme I would say is I've always been interested in entrepreneurship and building things, building organizations. That's something, an environment in which I think I've personally thrived a little more maybe than in sort of giant bureaucratic institutions. And so those threads have kind of come together through a lot of my somewhat idiosyncratic and disparate career path otherwise. And I think that biotech was really a nice opportunity to kind of be at the nexus of a lot of those things. Obviously opportunity to, bring forward medicines that really matter to a lot of patients, make a big difference for people. And then also obviously an area where, a lot of the exciting work, a lot of it is done in large pharmaceutical companies, but also a very large portion of it is done in more entrepreneurial organizations. And I had an opportunity to join Roivant as part of the very early team there. I was one of the first 10 employees. And, started out, I would say, as you can imagine, in more kind of general business functions that didn't require a ton of deep technical expertise in any particular functional area, and then was successful there and took on more and more leadership opportunities over time. Another thing I'd say I've really enjoyed about biotech, and I think has enabled me to contribute it's obviously a very technical area, but also very interdisciplinary. And I think in terms of, no one is a world leading expert in all of the, in statistics and in the regulatory issues and in the capital markets issues and in, basic biology, process chemistry, medicinal chemistry, clinical medicine, even within clinical medicine, different subspecialties. And so I think that, as an executive in this space, I think one thing that's valuable is to have enough ability to grasp and understand those different areas to be able to engage with people, on your team and externally who are the true experts in them, and then be able to, tie a lot of that together into, the right path forward for the organization. And in that sense, I actually think a liberal arts education, though perhaps slightly atypical for our field, is something that I think I've actually benefited from in many ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's really interesting, looking at the Priovant model and sort of broader Roivant, and for some of those of us that, have been around the pharma industry, are familiar with the Roivant story, sort of bringing together these two interesting strategies under one roof. On one sense, looking at out licensing of what might have one point been called sort of the low-hanging fruit of pharma companies, because those of us that hung out at pharma realize that they're not all blockbusters, and there are many products in the pharma pipelines that are just not sold. They're not the multi-billion-dollar blockbusters, but if we put a little effort behind them, great things can happen. And then the second part of that, this repurposing theme, not necessarily repurposing a molecule, but looking at some of these indications, as we're going to be getting into with autoimmune, that there's a lot of autoimmune diseases. And once you get past rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis and Crohn's disease, a lot of things we haven't heard of, like what we're talking about today, but which, again, are unmet medical needs that deserve these therapies. Talk about these two strategies, if you would, because I think they're really important in underlying what's going on in your organization.
Yeah, it's a great insight. And the founding of Priovant was really, I think, the nexus of those two things. And I think, obviously Roivant has, built a lot of its history in finding, promising molecules that are already in mid to late stage and setting up new biotechs around that. And Pfizer, I would say over the last, I don't know the exact number, but certainly 10 years has, as part of its R&D strategy, done some of these biotech spin-outs for areas, including very promising medicines like SpringWorks Therapeutics in the cancer space is one example, where they felt, for whatever reason, it's a very promising drug that does have the potential to be a blockbuster, but that it doesn't fit at that moment into their particular strategy. And so, I think those two things kind of came together from a sort of business angle from both the Roivant and Pfizer side. And then I think, that really coalesced with a kind of more, medical unmet need vision. I think we at Roivant, where I was working at the time, really kind of had this macro thesis that a lot of drug development in autoimmune disease was very heavily focused for finding, yet another treatment for, as you mentioned, IBD or psoriasis or RA. And there's really a lot of these very high morbidity, kind of rare but not ultra rare diseases that impact, tens of thousands to low hundreds of thousands of adults in the US, that collectively over 1 million people that are, very severe, very bad limitations on quality of life. And, there's not a ton of research going into them. I think you've started to see more and more. We're certainly not the only company doing that. MG is one area where obviously there's kind of fits that phenotype, and you've seen now, multiple blockbuster launches in that space. So I think this is an area where there's really a high unmet medical need, but also really an untapped commercial opportunity. As molecules like Vyvgart and Tepezza and others have shown in recent years through very successful launches there. And then in Brepocitinib, I think it's a molecule that through a dual TYK2 JAK1 inhibition, as you mentioned before, is really pharmacologically optimized for these high morbidity indications. In that through this approach, we're able to suppress the signaling of multiple pathogenic cytokines, type 1 interferon, type 2 interferon, IL-6, IL-12, IL-23, all with a single asset. And none of the approved JAK inhibitors are able to do that. And certainly a monoclonal antibody targeting a single cytokine can't do that. And so for these very high morbidity indications. They're high morbidity because there's a lot of inflammation across multiple organ systems, often multiple inflammatory pathways. So the pharmacology of the drug was really aligned with that strategy. And the Pfizer team was very bought into that, but actually agreed per their kind of R&D spin-out strategy that a standalone biotech company would really be better than the Pfizer team at pursuing that, because their autoimmune disease operation is really set up around these larger prevalence indications where they have existing commercial products. And, as for a giant corporation like that to pivot into something new, requires overcoming a lot of inertia. And so all of these factors just kind of coalesced, I think, into a perfect storm in a positive way of opportunity for us.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this, because I was up at Groton. This was about 23 years ago at a presentation that at the time Peter Lipsky, who was the head of NIAM's autoimmune branch at NIH, was giving at Pfizer on the JAK inhibitors and everything that was going to be coming down the pike and how important this class was. And now fast forward now and seeing you with, but I want to just sort of re-stress what you just mentioned, because you're dealing with something here. As you mentioned, that affects various interferons, various interleukins. And, we might have always thought of something like this in the past as a dirtier drug in the sense it's doing lots of stuff. But in your case, you're doing a lot of good things. And as we'll get into the clinicals in a bit, you had the steroid sparing effect also. And this is sort of holy grail type stuff in autoimmune disease. Can you say a couple words about that also? Because I think it's underappreciated, sort of this, the combinatorial nature of what this therapeutic is really doing compared, we hear so much about sort of like single magic bullets, but for a disease like this, we want to go beyond that a bit in targeting these various components of the autoimmune process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the JAK inhibitors, probably a lot of your audience is familiar with them, but just as a reminder, these are enzymes involved in the signal transduction of inflammatory cytokines. So, as immune cells are signaling to each other, the sort of process of the cytokine receptors actually transmitting their signal to the nucleus and then back, the JAK inhibitors or the JAK proteins are involved with that. And, there's 4 different isoforms: JAK1, JAK2, JAK3, and as an accident of biological discovery, TYK2. And different pairwise combinations are involved in the signaling of different cytokines. So there's kind of a number of really unique insights that came out of this. The first is that by inhibiting these enzymes, you can still, with a very targeted approach, impede the signaling of multiple cytokines versus just blocking the receptor where you're only blocking a single cytokine. And then the second is that the selectivity for different isoforms has an important impact on what your downstream impact is. So people tend to think of JAK inhibitors as a class of drugs. I think of it really more as kind of like a category of related
Yep.
drugs, and that actually, we really think of Brepocitinib as a TYK2 JAK1 inhibitor as a first-in-class molecule because it does different things pharmacologically than what the other approved JAK inhibitors do for the reasons I mentioned earlier in terms of getting that specific set of cytokine inhibition. And so I think I think it's really a very elegant solution that is particularly, as you noted, particularly well suited to some of these indications where a lot of approaches targeting single cytokines have not necessarily worked that effectively, and you do need broader immunosuppression. And then, the safety of the JAKs is obviously something that's also been, kind of watched over the past 5 to 10 years. And I think, around 5 years ago, at the turn of the last decade, there was a study, the oral surveillance study that compared tofacitinib, which is a Pfizer JAK inhibitor, to Humira and rheumatoid arthritis. And there were certain risks observed there. And I think, as time has gone on, though, I think people have come to realize that, to contextualize those risks, they were really most visible in patients over 50 with some cardiometabolic comorbidity. There's a lot of real world data now, for instance, in atopic dermatitis, where you've not necessarily seen that same level of risk. The absolute incidence of these events, even where the risk is elevated, is very low in absolute number. And so, certainly many monoclonal antibodies have risks and side effects as well. That's just when you're potently suppressing the immune system. There are obviously consequences and trade-offs to that. So I think, ultimately each physician and each patient have to make a case-by-case benefit risk decision. But what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years is that even in some of these larger, higher prevalence, perhaps not quite as morbid diseases as the ones we're pursuing, there's been a lot of appetite among clinicians and patients for use of JAK inhibitors. Rinvoq, which is an AbbVie product, is now roughly a $5 billion a year drug. That's all happened in the last few years. That's happened in indications like RA, psoriatic arthritis, atopic dermatitis, where there are a lot of biologics approved as well. And so, yeah, I think it's a compelling category of drugs overall. And then I think even among that, for Priovant, going into these high morbidity indications, where you're talking about in uveitis, very high risk of blindness. You're talking about in dermatomyositis, patients who often struggle to walk. I mean, these are very severe, very sick people. And, if you can deliver something efficacious for them, I think, again, for the vast majority of patients, the benefit risk is quite favorable. So, and happy to talk more about that too, because like you were saying before, many of these patients are being treated with, high dose steroids, which are extremely toxic, things like IVIG, which has both, very bad convenience problems, but then also is not very well tolerated either and has long-term safety risks as well. So, nothing is perfect, but I think for the diseases we're going into, the benefit risk of Brepocitinib seems to be extremely attractive. And I think, I was bringing up like the MG and TED examples before that, these large orphan indications, I think I'm very excited first and foremost about our ability to deliver value to patients who need these drugs, but uh, there's a lot of precedent of these indications becoming blockbuster launches and even quite quick blockbuster
Yeah,
launches in terms of the trajectory, and we certainly feel that that's something we can replicate.
absolutely. Absolutely. No, appreciate you laying all that out. I really wanted sort of the audience to get the feel for sort of where we are in terms of the pharmacology and why this compound is quite unique. Besides the fact that it's orally bioavailable, but has this really interesting profile mechanisms. And again, when you're, as you were just saying, when you're going after the greatest morbidity and mortality, we need these alternate approaches. And so, yeah, I mean, I would love to talk now a little bit about DM or dermatomyositis. Clearly, it's if we list, I don't know how many autoimmune diseases categories now, to 80 or so. It's a nasty one in terms of debilitating, long-term inflammation, muscle, skin. Something like 5% of patients died of malignancies, lung disease, cardiovascular disease. About 40,000 people. Take us into just, I mean, I see why you chose it, but why did you choose it? And how did you choose it as sort of the first indication?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think starts with the unmet need, which is very significant, and you walked through uh, quite accurately about 40,000 adults in the U.S., mostly muscle and skin inflammation, but these are on the skin side rashes that can cover large portions of a patient's body, be very painful, can lead to long-term disfigurement, can lead to significant hair loss. And then on the muscle side, in many cases, you see significant portions of patients reporting things like, difficulty walking a mile. A majority of patients require some sort of mobility aid, struggle to walk upstairs, struggle to, do things like carry groceries. So really severe limitations on quality of life. And some of the more severe patients end up in wheelchairs and they can't walk at all. So it's extremely debilitating just on those skin and muscle conditions or symptoms. And then, as you mentioned, too, it can really affect many other organ systems, most commonly the lung through ILD, but you also see elevated risk factors for cardiovascular disease, for different GI issues. So, really very debilitating disease, and for all these reasons, as you mentioned, can not only high morbidity, but also mortality as well. So there's that very significant unmet need, very little available to patients. Standard of care here remains really high dose steroids, and then ISTs like methotrexate, mycophenolate, azathioprine. All of these have limited efficacy, and pretty tough safety profiles, particularly steroids. Intravenous immunoglobulin, as I mentioned before, is approved. But that again has a lot of challenges. It requires patients coming into an infusion center 3 days in a row, once a month for several hours a day. And then that also is a pretty poorly tolerated therapy, a lot of complaints around headaches, nausea, and then also, safety profile in terms of VTE and other things like that are a risk factor there. So that's not a super appealing option to a lot of patients either. So first of all, very significant unmet need, and then I think very strong biologic rationale for Brepocitinib in the indication. Type 1 interferon is kind of viewed generally, and there's a lot of evidence for this, as probably the single biggest driver of the disease pathology. And actually, talked about the different pairwise combinations of JAK enzymes and cytokine signaling. Type 1 interferon signaling is mediated through both JAK1 and TYK2. So Brepocitinib can kind of uniquely hit that. But then also there's a lot of other cytokines involved in DM, in the DM disease course as well. Type 2 interferon, interferon gamma, is particularly known to be involved, and then also a number of others as well. And so this is where you're getting into the value of Brepocitinib being able to inhibit all of these cytokines versus just being able to hit one of them. So that's quite compelling. And then we've seen actually clinical evidence from particularly tofacitinib and some other JAK inhibitors as well that have been used in investigator-initiated trials or off-label case reports, suggesting that this mechanism can be effective. So, we've got the biologic rationale, we've got some clinical validation from related drugs, and a tremendous unmet need. So those really came together, and we saw a great opportunity, and we actually, on the basis of the kind of totality of phase 2 data of Brepocitinib, which is quite compelling across now 7 phase 2 studies in different indications, we went straight to a phase 3 program in dermatomyositis, given what we saw as the opportunity and urgency, and that study is now fully enrolled, reading out next year. So very, very excited about that. And if that goes well, we'll plan to move ahead with an NDA filing on the back of that. So, potential approval of the therapy here in the not too distant future.
Awesome. And I love hearing stories about small young companies like yourselves that are deep into phase 3 with a therapy like this that could really make a lot of waves. And you were just mentioning the study. It's known as Valor. It's not a small study. So aside from screening and follow up, you have 52 weeks of blinded treatment. There's a 52-week open label. You're just looking at the sort of the inclusion criteria here, patients that have, we're talking about very sick patients here, but those that are not responsive to corticosteroids and other immunosuppressive drugs, immunomodulatory drugs. So really, people that are having a hard time, you got a couple different doses. Walk us through Valor. Take a little time with this in terms of the structure of the study. And if you could introduce us to this endpoint known as total improvement score. We talked a little bit about, ACR criteria for things like rheumatoid arthritis, which, this composite of physician and patient assessments and other biologic assessments. There's a bunch of things that go into the total improvement score with DM, and I was wondering if you could walk us through that as well, so we can understand what the FDA is, and you guys may be looking at a success in this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, the study is testing 2 doses of Brepocitinib, 15 milligrams once daily and 30 milligrams once daily. Again, as we've discussed before, this is oral once daily administration, which is another exciting feature of the molecule. So it's testing those against placebo, randomized 1-to-1-to-1. The study enrolled 241 patients globally across US, Europe, and then some patients in South America and Asia. So large global study. It's actually the largest interventional clinical trial ever conducted in dermatomyositis. So it was actually operationally a pretty Herculean effort to get done. And I'll talk a bit more about the study design of it, but I think, one thing I would highlight too is for these rare diseases, in running these clinical trials, you need to work with the experts. And a lot of these experts are at academic centers of excellence where they're very busy, have a lot going on. It's not like running a psoriasis trial or even an RA trial where you can just kind of go to private practices whose sole purpose is to run RA trials. And so it really requires a lot of work and effort and partnering with the patient groups, partnering with the thought leaders to kind of get everyone motivated and excited. And I think the fact that we were able to get for a rare disease, such a large global study done in the time frame we did as a small company is a testament to the enthusiasm that I think the patient community and the medical community have for the asset and its potential here. We put a lot of thought into first the study design in terms of the patient population, and you were alluding to this. a bit, but we required patients with both active skin and muscle disease. The vast majority of DM patients do have both active skin and muscle disease, but there are some who at different points in their treatment, may only have one or the other. In particular, there are some patients who present mostly with skin disease throughout their full disease course. And so we required both of those as an opportunity to really demonstrate the drug's ability to have improvement on both skin and muscle. So that was one important criteria. And then, as you also mentioned, background standard of care. So patients had to either be on a background dose of or have previously failed steroids or an IST. So, patients that have been refractory to the standard of care therapy. And as I was mentioning before, that's that's basically all of the patients, because this is a pretty sick population. As you mentioned, the study is 52 weeks, and I'll walk through the two features. The first, which you asked about, is the primary endpoint, which is the composite score, total improvement score. So this is a composite of 6 different core set measures that measure different disease activity. The largest single input into that is what's called the MMT8, which is a manual muscle testing assessment tool. So it's an examination the doctor does of the patient, where they kind of test the patient's strength across a variety of different muscle groups and score that. There's also a number of other clinical assessments in terms of physicians' global assessments. There's patients' global assessments. There's another PRO called the Health Assessment Questionnaire, which is a patient survey that gets factored in. So I think a lot of valuable input that goes into that endpoint. With one exception, all of the inputs to the total improvement score are either physician-assessed clinical endpoints or patient-reported outcomes. So, they do have some subjectivity in them. And I think, we've been very focused really on rater training, rater selection, working and partnering very closely with our investigators to try to reduce noise and any risk of placebo response across a 52-week study. A different endpoint that's not part of the TIS is called the CDASI, which is a skin-only assessment. That's an important endpoint as well that we'll be reporting out on, that measures only skin activity. I think skin activity is certainly incorporated into the total improvement score. But, because of the role of the MMT8 in it, muscle activity certainly predominates that score. And so we have that separate skin-only endpoint to really be able to hopefully show benefit on both of those things. And then a final real focus of ours has been steroid tapering. So about 3/4 of patients in the study have come in on background steroids, and we've been, both per the protocol and there's a mandatory steroid taper for appropriate patients in the protocol, and then just really in general working very closely with our investigators on patients where it is appropriate to taper them during the taper window in the study, to really try to drive that as low as possible. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is to help manage placebo response, which is always a risk in these longer studies in an autoimmune disease that waxes and wanes with subjective endpoints. So I think that focus on steroid tapering will really help there. And then also to be able to show steroid sparing benefit is something that we hope to be able to demonstrate through this. And we've actually, thanks to our investigators and their buy-in to this, we've actually had a lot of success so far in the study of obviously right now it's just pooled data, but the sort of pooled blinded data across all patients in terms of bringing steroid use down through the study. So that's something that we're very excited about as well.
Yeah, it's again, that's one of the ones that's always sort of reinforced towards me as being sort of a holy grail thing. And if you can do that at some level, you win
Yeah.
in a major way. And again, I have no doubt that this is going to be extremely successful once you open all this up in 2025. Could you say, I mean, if I'm getting into confidential stuff, we can just gloss over this, but can you sort of talk about what comes next? Because clearly you're on the path towards, as a small biotech shop, on the path towards an NDA here. You originally sort of spun out. I think Pfizer even owns a little part of you. What sort of is the ideal situation that happens next? Do you shop this to the world of big pharma? Is it ever in Priovant's strategy to say, hey, it'd be cool to have a nice little specialty sales force here and do this on our own? What technically will come next when everything looks great next year?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think first from just kind of a corporate structure perspective, because I sometimes get asked this, given the way we were set up, our kind of two shareholders are Roivant and Pfizer, obviously, in addition to the employees. But Priovant is set up as a company, so we no one has any kind of like rights or anything like that in terms of we actually do have a partnership with Pfizer for commercialization in certain ex-US territories, but in terms of the core US commercial rights, the shareholders are institutions, but effectively for those sorts of purposes the same as any other shareholder. I think then kind of as far as so that gives us the optionality then to kind of pursue whatever we think is correct for the company, not really influenced by anyone else. And then as far as what that is, our base case plan is to be ready to launch the drug ourselves and to launch the drug ourselves. We have a chief commercial officer at the company. She spent a lot of time at Alexion as well as Genzyme earlier in her career, even before that, back when they were standalone companies. So a lot of experience with rare disease launches. And I think if you look at precedent, both historically, but also even more recent precedent, these rare diseases are where biotech companies have had more success transitioning from development stage organizations to commercial stage organizations. Argenx, I was mentioning Vyvgart earlier, Argenx being a great example of that recently. And I think there's a reason for that, which is that in these rare diseases, the physician set who you're working with in development is pretty high overlap to who you're working with in the commercial setting. So your investigators, your KOLs, and your high prescribers are all kind of the same universe of people. And that's very different than again, an indication like RA or psoriasis or eczema, where you've got one group of KOLs, then you've got a different set of people who are your sites, and then when you go commercial, there's a whole new world of treating clinicians, and so I think you can actually get an advantage from that of kind of having that continuity from development to commercial launch, and then you were alluding to this before, but just obviously building any commercial organization from scratch is a large operational lift, but certainly doing it in a specialty indication with the smaller specialty sales force is a more manageable way to do it than otherwise. So, I think we're prepared for that. We're set up for success. I think if large pharma companies come a-knocking, our ears are always open to hear what they have to say. But it's not a situation where we're gonna have what we hope and expect to be a great readout and then, hire a bank the next day to shop the company. It's nothing like that. our plan on the back of that is to, to get ready to, first obviously do the NDA submission and approval, and then in parallel to that, get ready for a very successful launch. And I'm confident in our ability to deliver that. But like I said, of course, all options are on the table.
Great. As you were mentioning before, you're not a one-trick pony here because you've been also focusing on this non-infectious uveitis indication, which I think you have a phase 3 starting in this as well
Yeah.
later in the year. Could you talk a little about this one too? Because and this is, I mean, it still falls into orphan, but this isn't really that rare at all. And from what I was reading, there's also I guess, a significant pediatric population with this one. So, could you talk just a little bit about what's happening in NIU in the company?
Yes. So NIU, non-infectious uveitis, it's a ocular inflammation. It can occur on its own idiopathically, and then it can also occur in conjunction with other autoimmune diseases as well. Again, this is a quite severe disease. It's the fourth leading cause of blindness among working age population in the developed world. So, very, very debilitating, very, very high risk disease, and in need of very aggressive treatment is really what physicians and patients are looking for. There's uveitis can occur in different parts of the eye. So it is generally broken into kind of two very high level categories, which is anterior uveitis and non-anterior. So anterior is where it's localized to the front of the eye, and often those patients can be treated with topical treatments, ocular topical treatments, so eye drops and things like that. The prevalence of NIU, including anterior uveitis, as you were alluding to, is quite large. It's around 400,000 people. Our focus with a systemic therapy is non-anterior uveitis, and that's what we expect our label to be. There's certain sub-elements of non-anterior uveitis too, in terms of exactly where in the eye it's appearing. But non-anterior uveitis is for both clinical purposes and regulatory purposes a single indication statement. And of course, non-anterior uveitis can include inflammation at the front of the eye as well, but it requires some involvement beyond the front of the eye. That patient population is more in the range of 70,000 to 100,000 patients. So, kind of in that orphan category of below 200,000, but quite large and quite high prevalence. And a number of doctors will say that in their view, there's a lot of patients who are diagnosed with anterior uveitis, but who actually do have some inflammation in other parts of the eye that maybe just the kind of frontline community practitioner didn't catch necessarily. So I think, there's both kind of a large identified population and I think a potential untapped, undiagnosed population on top of that. And again, this is a very severe disease. If you think about even just from yourself as a patient, if you have, even the symptoms we were talking about with dermatomyositis, very, very, bad, terrible symptoms. But, if you wake up one day and, you can't see anything, you're going to the emergency room like immediately. And so, there tends to be very aggressive treatment patterns here. Usually, kind of the first line treatment is to give patients a steroid burst of around 60 milligrams per day. So, that's completely unsustainable chronically. 15 milligrams a day is a high dose for chronic steroids, very high. So 60 is a whole other level. So it's really a steroid burst to just kind of get the inflammation under control, allow the patient to see again, which is obviously the top priority. And then you kind of go from there to immediately looking to transition the patients off those steroids onto some sort of maintenance therapy. And that can be, again, kind of your standard ISTs, methotrexate, mycophenolate, azathioprine. Those really do not work very well for uveitis. Humira is approved for non-infectious uveitis. So unlike DM, where there's really no modern therapy approved, Brepocitinib would be the first one. Here we do have one approved. I would not say that uveitis is the indication where Humira necessarily produced the best data. And so the failure rate of Humira is, both from the clinical trial data and real world experience, in excess of 50%. So it does help. It does help, many patients, but there's a huge population of patients who are refractory to that. And you see a lot of patients on off-label therapies as well. It's really doctors kind of try this kitchen sink sort of approach to just, giving whatever they can to keep the inflammation under control. So, we saw this as really a great opportunity for Brepocitinib. Really fits that kind of category of indication we described earlier in terms of this unmet need. Very large, very large commercial opportunity as well. And we had phase 2 data earlier this year that was quite good. We modeled our study on the approval studies of Humira, and the efficacy we saw in our treatment arm was significantly better. Because of the nature of the treatment paradigm here, the endpoint slightly counterintuitively is treatment failure. So actually lower is better. And so our treatment failure rate was about half of what Humira's was. So, twice as many patients being able to, remain under control through 6 months. Obviously, this is a smaller phase 2 study comparing that to an approval study in phase 3. So that's why we're running the phase 3. But we feel really good about the profile here, and assuming that data is replicated, or not even completely replicated, but something approximating it. I think this will be a very compelling treatment option for physicians, both for the patients who are trying Humira and failing, which is tens of thousands of patients, so a very large population, as well as potentially even as a first line kind of post-steroidal treatment option. And so we're very excited about this. As you mentioned, the phase 3 trial is kind of starting up as we speak, and we're already getting sites activated and starting to screen, and should be enrolling our first patient quite soon.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you could say a couple words. You have this very well articulated and laid out expanded access policy on the Priovant website, and clearly, this has become sort of recognized as a leader in this space of these under treated severe autoimmune diseases. No doubt you get contacted broadly about across the autoimmune spectrum of from patients that whether it be something more traditional or a lot of these ones that we only hear a little bit about. Can you say a couple words about the expanded access policy and any interesting stories related to that in terms of what you're allowed to sort of compassionately help with at this stage of the game in terms of Brepocitinib?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we haven't had any use of the drug outside of the clinical trials, which I think even for having a policy like ours is pretty standard for a drug that's not yet FDA approved. We have made a big effort, as you mentioned before, to have significant open label extension studies in all of our trials. Obviously one benefit from that is you collect more data, but really a big driver of that is to the patients and giving them an opportunity to be on drug as long as possible. We haven't yet had any patients complete the open label extension yet, but certainly when that happens, plan to work to ensure that that the people in need are taken care of. And then I think we also are DM and NIU are our two main focuses now, but I think there's a lot of other indications that kind of fit that phenotype, and we're actively thinking right now about other diseases in which to start Priovant sponsored clinical programs that would give us a great opportunity to to provide access to other patients as well. So right now a lot of this is really being done mostly through through the formal studies and formal development program.
So, but we're going to be watching for what happens in 2025 per the readouts, both in NIU and DM. While we have you, anything else that I missed while we have you today, Ben? Whether it's on other clinical programs or just anything related to you and the company, conferences, talks, anything upcoming for the rest of 2024 in terms of the circuit that we should know about, places we could run into you, meet you, watch you give a talk, anything else on the calendar, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I would say the rest of 2024, actually on NIU, we have a number of things. Later this month is the EURETINA conference, which is an ophthalmology
Yep.
conference, European focused in Barcelona, but several members of our team, including me, will be there, and we will some of our additional data on the phase 2 uveitis study that's not been shared publicly before is going to be presented there on some of the vascular leakage and fluorescein angiography imaging. So that will be exciting. And then at the American Academy of Ophthalmology meeting in October, we're going to have actually multiple presentations of the Brepocitinib data, including some of the patient level data on macular edema, which is an important complication of uveitis and one of the causes of blindness in patients. And we got some, early but promising data from the phase 2 there that we're going to we've shared some of that publicly already, but are going to be sharing that in more detail at the Academy in October. So I think those are two great opportunities, I would say, especially the AAO meeting in Chicago in October. And then also by the end of the year, we're planning to put out the phase 2 study in NIU. The primary endpoint was at 6 months, but the study duration was 1 year. And so we'll be putting out 1-year data on that by the end of the year. So I think, those are all exciting near-term milestones for the rest of this year. And then looking ahead to next year, obviously continued progress with NIU, but there the focus will really be towards looking ahead to the DM readout. We'll be putting out even more of our baseline data from the Valor trial in early 2025, most likely, and then building up obviously to the readout itself in the second half of the year. And I think that's really the big milestone. And I would say I think Priovant over the last few years, we've maybe flown a bit under the radar. And I think in part by design, because we kind of launched the company back at the end of 2021, had a great vision, and then we needed to put our heads down and get some stuff done, not talk about it, just do it. And that's what we did. But I think now we're really approaching a time in 2025 where, starting with the Valor readout, there's going to be a run of really pretty exciting milestones for the company that I think, provide both great news for patients who need it, but also just in terms of the the kind of value accretion of the company itself. I think really a lot of major opportunities and major accelerants coming up. So I think, I think now heading into early next year is kind of the time for people to really start paying attention to that and digging in, because I think, I think we'll be increasingly on the radar, I think, as we look ahead to the next few years.
I'm for one excited for you, and just really, I'm looking forward to 2025, seeing the readouts. And I appreciate you allowing us to help you tell your story and get the
No,
word
thank
out
you. I
there.
appreciate
So
you giving me the
yeah,
opportunity. It was a
yeah.
great discussion and great questions.
Yeah,
So.
it's really fun. And again, best to this for you, for the whole company and your team. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of the show across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Ben Zimmer, Chief Executive Officer, Priovant Therapeutics, doing really amazing things to advance these novel therapeutics for patients with these unmet medical needs of severe autoimmune disorders. Ben, again, thank you for your time and taking us through this amazing story. Thank you for everything you do for the millions of patients out there. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for them. Really an awesome story. And I look forward to following up and watching an exciting 2025 for you guys.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, and look forward to speaking with you again, hopefully on the back of all of that.
We'll do it. We'll do it. Talk to you soon.
Perfect.